Greetings, everyone. My name is Ivan Tutsakov, and I would like to take you through a bit of a journey, through a bit of a lecture series, through an exploration of how cultural systems work. I've taken a very bottom-up approach with this project. The book is called Forces of Society, and it represents a way to see the world. It's a model of how to understand the way our cultural systems are built all around us. And in the process, we'll be able to learn how material world works, how biological systems work, and as a result, how cultural systems work. I would like to start this whole lecture series with this one drawing that I drew, which represents what we already know to be the tree of matter, how matter lays as the root and lower branches of our entire existence. And within the material world, the forces of matter are the forces that are at play. And we're very good with calculating those through physics and mathematics and geometry. And we're very good with predicting the material world as well. Out of those emerges another branch, which are driven by forces of life, which we pretty much already understand through disciplines like biology and chemistry, especially biochemistry. Where things become a bit murkier, and this is the exploration that I've undertaken in the last decade or so, is at which point and in which systems of biological world of life the world of culture emerges, and in which way can we understand what forces of culture are as opposed to what we understand the forces of matter are and what the forces of life are. And to a large degree, we also understand very much through biology and biochemistry how forces of life influence us. And I'm attempting to do the very same approach with forces of culture. As a result, that's why I called the book Forces of Society. Because there are literally forces that are driven purely through cultural influences. Before I start, I would like to introduce a few concepts. Everyone's familiar with the good old bell curve. Now, in order to fully understand systems, we have to recognize them as independent entities. We need to ask ourselves what consists an entity that is independent and functioning. One approach to do that is to think about how often a specific occurrence or an event or an emergence happens in the course of a certain time. And when we do our observations, and this applies, by the way, to both subjective and objective worlds, when the experience or the entity expresses itself, that's when we know that there's an instance of it. Now, if those instances are regular, then we would know that that object or that expression or emergence is to be counted on. And the larger the amount of occurrences, the more we can recognize it as an entity that actually exists. In statistics, this is expressed through a bell curve where the area between these two values is about 68%. And 68% is 0.2. 68% is pretty much 2/3 of an occurrence in order for something to be considered statistically significant. If it's higher than that, only in the range of second standard deviation, which is up here, we would have 95% in between these two worlds, in which case something's even more present and reoccurring. And reoccurrence is what our interest, whether a reoccurrence happens through replication in some process, or whether reoccurrence happens just by the fact that we don't have to see the inner playings of the machinery within the entity. As long as we can observe it, we can call it an occurrence. To give quick examples out of matter, an occurrence would be us observing whether, a cup of water is still there an hour later, or whether certain molecules. And with molecules, their rate of expression is pretty much 100% at all times. That's how reliable the world of atoms is in our physical world. Even though there's always, through Heisenberg and all those formulas that him and the rest of physicians have offered, there's always a probability that an electron could shoot off, however small that is. And that would exist in a very small fringe sides of the bell curve of expression of all the atoms, which is next to nil. In the world of life, we would want to observe whether a specific bacteria expresses itself, whether in the form of it surviving for a while or maybe replicating itself as well, which makes life defined as such. We can see the occurrence of any life form and the processes around within the life form. And if we, spot certain whales passing through or certain fish passing through the oceans every year, then we have a certain probability of how much that species exists on planet Earth, for example. And then, of course, there's the cultural systems, in which case, as we will explore, we would want to think whether a specific society is present in the world with their roles that they play and their behaviors in the world. And if they're here tomorrow and the day after tomorrow, the more that happens, the more we can call that society as an existing entity. After all, sometimes you can have societies that gather only seasonally, or for family gatherings in Western worlds happen on specific dates, whereas most of the time those groups of people don't coexist together. They're very independent from each other, as opposed to, say, Eastern societies where family group settings stay around each other, next to each other much more frequently. And what I'd like to present in this point is a quick diagram to outline how I will be exploring this tree of the emergence of cultural systems. And that is by looking at the entire world of reoccurring matter. We want to start with the world of recurring matter, because we know that the recurrence is very, very reliable. Within those, we have everlasting compounds and atoms. There's a specific section within that world, a subgroup, if you will, of biomolecules with replicative biochemical processes as defined to create life. Or better to say, that's how life was defined, based on how we observed the behaviors of these specific matters. So a molecule becomes a biomolecule if it's involved in the world of life. Whereas if it's not, we can technically just call it a molecule. What's interesting about this is that different molecules can be biomolecules or molecules at different times, depending on whether they happen to find themselves in this world or whether they find themselves in this world. And certain atoms and molecules will never mix with biomolecules, but by and large, many of them are floating in and out. But the system of life remains independent and solid. And the reason why it's of significance for us is that life actually replicates its own entities that it itself emerged, which technically is a chicken and egg situation already. Similar chicken and egg situation happens pretty much on every layer of different emergences that happen. Sometimes it's hard to tell what started first, whether it was the chicken or whether it was the egg. In this case, whether life started replicating or whether there was already things that were getting replicated that became just enclosed, in which case we defined life that way. So based on the definition, whether it's a chicken or egg, this outlines how really relative things can be when thinking of defining any specific entity within the system, which brings me to cultural systems, because one of my biggest challenges and one of the biggest reasons why I chose to write on this topic was because when it comes to cultural systems, it's very not well defined. The terminology is very poor. The world of matter is extremely precisely and well defined. The world of biochemistry is very, very well defined as well, whereas the world of cultures, words have many different meanings. And I have condensed the meanings. I have essentially decided to stick to one meaning per word, even if I chose a specific definition for the word that might not end up being the standard way that is taught in certain larger or smaller societies, especially when it comes to scientific societies or societies that create scientific definitions of lingo. So within the process of the replicated compounds of life, which represent this bubble that comes out of the recurring matter, because there's a specific group of biochemical messengers and other biomolecules. So it's biochemical messengers I'm using very specifically because cultures are predominantly observed to exist as culture is defined, within animal systems. And animal systems function based off neural circuitries and through communication, where there's feedback cycles that create replicative structures that we will call cultural systems. And those, all our neurons, all our circuitries of nervous systems in our brains are run by biochemical messengers. Now, biochemical messengers exist in trees, they exist in a lot of life outside of animal systems. And the question begs whether those can be called cultural. And the way I approach this is that as long as we can see a replication of a specific, as I call it, conflation, that's why I call it here conflations. They're replicated neurotransmitter conflations. Conflation is a specific firing within, say, my nervous system to utter the sentence that I'm uttering that can be defined as sort of a neural cloud within me. And that I would just call a conflation, as I defined conflation to be whatever's firing in order for me to do the action that I'm doing right now. So if my action's involved in a cultural system, then let's call it batch of neurotransmitters with replicative sociochemical processes. So sociochemical because cultures actually replicate themselves within societal systems. You can't really replicate something just by yourself because eventually you will die, and then whatever you ever knew is going to die with you. But if you're within a society, then you can actually spread that. So the conflations that you carry with you, the neural firings that happen with you, if those are circulating in the society which you live, then those will be considered a cultural entities within builders of cultural systems as entities. If you go for a walk by yourself in the mountains and nobody even knows about it and nothing comes out of it, then that could be considered an acultural event. And we're very much immersed in cultural system, much more than we almost would give ourselves credit. But that's nature, nurture for you. Biology is nature, and nurture is really the cultural system conditioning us and kind of harnessing us into a slot that it wants us to be. So as a result, we'll have a subgroup of cultural systems that we will be looking at. To wrap up this is mainly the introduction to the lecture series that I'm about to release. And I just wanted to give you an indicator of how to approach and think about all this before we dive deep in. The deep dive in is going to look like this. This is our big map of all the layers. There's actually a total of 12 layers. We're going to be examining each one of these layers through each lecture series that I do it. The only thing that I'm going to reveal before we move on to the actual lectures is let me just bring up the tree back again. The root of the tree in this case is going to be starting at the very bottom, which is our elementary particles. We'll be talking about that. And the world of matter will be basically this trunk right here with the branches is basically going to be these areas right here. And life essentially starts here, as we will see. Right around here where it cuts in, epigenetic tags, genes, and proteins are actually part of life, as I was just explaining. So I could have included some of the entities that are part of life as well, but much of viruses are not part of life. So this area right here, considering that viruses have genes and proteins in them, technically don't belong in life, because a virus can survive on its own completely outside of life. And then once it gets back in, then it's part of life again. It's actually a perfect example. Viruses are perfect examples of non-living entities that can exist within a living entity. That's why I wouldn't call a virus a non-living entity, because it's about what role the virus can play in a living entity that makes it technically alive or functioning within a living system. Because every molecule and every entity is technically not alive. It's just that the viruses have an ability to leave the body and come back, but so does oxygen, and CO2 and the rest. Similarly, the layers that we'll be building within the living system, we're going to start looking in specific ways the living systems behave in order to create conditions to create cultural systems. And those will happen within sociocultural groups of animal living forms. And life officially begins within the world of sociality, where certain cultural traits start to get replicated, and we will be looking at that as well. And similarly, there's specific roles and scripts that we play out within societal systems that I could have included here as well in order to allow it to be in cultural systems. But just like a virus can leave the body and come back, similarly, a circus in a, that travels around the world, can leave a city and arrive in another city and be able to perfectly function, even though the circus is a fully functional and independent unit or entity or an emergence of its own kind. And then we'll build to see what else gets built up. And as a result, we'll get a chance to explore the world of forces of society. And as you see, we have a whole lot of work to do before we can actually look at what societies are and how they function. So I hope you'll join me in this journey to see how this all works together. And I'm excited to share this knowledge with you. Thank you again, and see you very soon.